reconstruct the changes in global temperature over the past 150 years. So this is, again, time. This is the global mean temperature. And this is just the departure from the average temperature between like 1960 and 1990. And you can see there's this, and these different colored lines represent different scientific groups' estimates of what the temperature change has been over this period. And you can see that there's a very clear warming trend, that over the past century, the global average temperature of the planet has increased by about 1 degree centigrade or 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see that the climate we're living in now is very different than what it was 100 years ago. The last decade has been the warmest decade, not just in the last century, but we can go back even further with paleoclimatic records. And the last decade that we've been living in is warmer than any decade in the last millennia. So we're living in a different climate than what the Earth has experienced in the last 1,000 years. But our evidence for warming doesn't just come from thermometers. There's all sorts of other indicators that the planet is warming. And one of those indicators are just mountain glaciers. You know, mountain glaciers are ice. You warm up ice, it melts. This is a picture of the Riggs Glacier in 1941. This is what it looked like in 2004. So this is taken from the same perspective. All of this ice is now water and run off. And this isn't just this one glacier. You look at glaciers worldwide. Mountain glaciers are retreating. But it's not just that. If you look at in the Arctic, the amount of the ocean in the Arctic that's covered by sea ice is decreasing. If we look at Greenland, Greenland is melting. This is something called a moulin, which I'll talk about again in a second. And this is all meltwater coming off the surface of Greenland, running down into a giant cave, runs down to the bottom of Greenland, and lubricates the base of this giant ice shelf. And it's not just that. There's a whole list of indicators of a warming planet. Snow cover and permafrost is decreasing. The sea level is rising. The amount of heat in the ocean is increasing. The frequency and duration of droughts is increasing, and so forth. And the point here is that our evidence of a warming planet doesn't just come from just the thermometers. There's a consistent pattern of these changes that indicate a warming. Yeah, you have a question?
Last month, it was recorded the most amount of sea ice in Antarctica, I believe.
In the Arctic?
Yeah.
Yeah, they reached, well, in terms of the seasonal cycle, the maximum occurs in the wintertime.
No.
But last summer was the smallest amount of cover, yeah, ever. And it was a dramatic decrease. I'll show that in a second, that almost 30% relative to the year 2006 decreased. It was really, you can't help but look at something like that and be concerned. And so the point of all these different patterns of warming is that the fact that the Earth is warming is unequivocal. And that word was chosen very carefully just to convey the overwhelming confidence that we have in making that statement. So the take-home message from this most recent report is that yeah, we know that the planet is warming, and that most of the warming over the past 50 years is likely, meaning now that we're confident at the 90% level, that the warming is due to human activities.
Yes, on the science, I've seen the glacier now has gone into the water due to increasing the Earth temperature.
Right. Yeah. Water is one of these important quantities. It's actually a very strong greenhouse gas. So that as the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere increases, it acts to further enhance the greenhouse effect.
Yes. I hope to stop the global warming.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think, as we'll see, I think a lot of us will hope that.
By decrease the emission
from the burning of fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels, need to find something else.
Right. Okay. So this brings us to the question, so we know that the planet is warming. And what does this mean for Florida, and South Florida in particular? And as I said, there's really two aspects that I think are most critical to South Florida. One, we see here are hurricanes, and this is a picture of Hurricane Wilma. And the other is sea level rise, because Florida is such a low-lying state. One thing we know for sure is that it's going to get warmer. So if you remember that temperature curve I showed you, that temperature curve from the instrumental record is right here, from 1860 out to 2000. This record back here goes back to the year 1000 AD, and this is based on reconstructions of paleoclimatic evidence like tree rings and so forth. We can reconstruct what the temperature changes were, and this gray area represents the uncertainty of that. So this is the change in global mean temperature over the last millennia. And this period here, this increase here are the projected changes that we're anticipating to occur over the next century. And so right now we're here, okay? And so you can see here that the warming that we've experienced over the last century pales in comparison to what is projected to occur over the next century. And in fact, there's a lot of uncertainty on this upper end of the range for what the global temperature will be. The lower end, we know, in fact, we're already committed to at least another degree centigrade of warming, simply because the Earth is still trying to catch up with our past emissions of greenhouse gases. So this yellow band here represents the amount of warming that the Earth would experience by the year 2100, even if we were able to stabilize greenhouse gases today. If we went out tomorrow and said there's going to be no more increases in greenhouse gases, we're still committed for at least another degree centigrade warming. That warming is unavoidable. It's already in the pipeline. So what does this mean for, say, hurricane activity? Okay. Now, if I say, I mean, do you think that hurricane activity will increase as the oceans warm? Most of you, as I said, if you've lived in South Florida the last couple of years, the one thing you know, if you're listening to the meteorologists on TV, they say, okay, as the hurricane goes over warmer water, it's going to intensify, right? So, I mean, I think most people, even who aren't meteorologists, associate warmer oceans with increased hurricane activity, but it actually turns out it's not that simple. It turns out that sorry. Whatever I did, I promise I won't do it again. Okay, as I said, it turns out it's not that simple. It is true that if you warm hurricanes locally near the storm, that does lead to an increase in the intensity of the storm, and that can lead to an increase in the development and genesis of hurricanes. But it also turns out that if you warm the ocean away from the storm, that actually acts to stabilize the atmosphere and decrease hurricane activity. So our current theory suggests that there will actually be little change in the intensity of hurricanes from global warming, because global warming is truly global. You're not only warming locally near the storm, but you're also warming the oceans in other remote regions like the Indian and the Pacific Ocean, and the warming in those basins actually acts to decrease the intensity of hurricanes. So our theory suggests that, as we understand it, global warming really shouldn't lead to that much of an increase in hurricane activity. On the other hand, there's pretty strong empirical evidence that suggests that hurricane activity is pretty tightly correlated to the ocean surface temperatures. And what I'm showing here, these are just two curves. One of them is the temperature of the ocean surface in the Atlantic Ocean, the tropical Atlantic, where the hurricanes form. And the other is something called the power dissipation index, which is basically a measure of hurricane activity in the Atlantic. And it really doesn't, I mean, one of them, the green one is the hurricane activity, the blue one is the ocean surface temperature, and you can see they're very tightly correlated. You know, as one goes up, the other goes up. And so, while the theory suggests that there really shouldn't be much of an increase in hurricane activity from global warming, observations show a very strong correlation between the amount of hurricane activity in the Atlantic and changes in ocean surface temperature. And this is a very contentious area within the scientific community. In contrast to global warming, where there's a great deal of confidence in the past changes and that the climate is going to continue to warm in the future, the implications of this, of the warming for hurricane activity is hotly debated. And you could get 5 of the scientists up here, and you would get 5 very different perspectives on that. In my opinion, I don't think that global warming is going to lead to a significant increase in hurricane activity, but you could get another very well-respected scientist here and get a very different opinion on that. But